Kezia was 14 when she watched her dad die. He always drove too fast, speeding across the open moorland as if his open-top convertible was as safe as an armoured tank. She sat in the passenger seat, loving the feeling of flying as the wind blew her hair back from her face. From here, she could breathe in deeply the smell of the sheep-chewed grass. She savoured it. It mingled in her nostrils with the more elusive tang of fear and excitement. The scent of peat bogs and Dartmoor ponies forever merged in her memory with the bitter aftertaste of burning rubber. But most prominent of all was the smell of her dad as he sat behind the wheel, laughing at her squeals as he rounded bend after bend, faster and faster. His aroma would always be the fragrance of her childhood, a mixture of cigar smoke, wood smoke, and, what was it? In essence, it couldn't be anything else but the very scent of life to her home. "Dad, go faster," she pleaded, her knuckles blanched white as she gripped both sides of the bucket seat. And he did. He did anything she asked him. The day he died started like any other. Nothing remarkable really, except, maybe, a fleeting flicker of unease as she reached for the door handle of his red vintage sports car. Later she would remember this brief sensation and suppose that it might be a premonition, but at the time she felt only her anticipation. This was her favourite time of day, uninterrupted time with her dad. He allowed himself this early morning drive as a way to loosen the ghosts, as he put it, a way into whatever he was writing at the time, and he wanted her with him. It was no different today. It was spring, April to be exact. A damp chill was suspended in the air. The mist at this time of the year always hung around on the moor like a friend who stays too long after a party. A hazy pre-dawn glow filled the sky, framing the ancient woodland next to the house. Kezia loved her home, and every morning she'd stand silently in the same spot and listen to the birds singing their very own start to the day. From here, outside the cottage, she could smell the dewy bluebells that shared the borders with the weeds. Their combined fragrance held firm to the mist, and with each breath the familiar balloon inflated in her chest. How else to describe this feeling of pure happiness? She glanced up and saw that her dad was smiling at her with that look on his face. "Huh?" said Kezia. "What are we waiting for, little one?" The question pulled her from her thoughts. "Nothing," she answered, returning his smile. "Let's go." They found themselves in their usual place, huddled together, cross-legged, on damp, lichen-covered stones at the top of their tor. The mist obscured the view down to the village below, but the church tower cut through like a floating top hat on a soupy sea. The gorse had begun to flower, filling the air with the scent of coconut. Bilberries were starting to form on the low-lying bushes, and Kezia felt sure she heard a cuckoo's call breaking through the silence. "You know, I used to come up here during the war and watch the bombs falling on Plymouth. Your granddad was away fighting in Africa, and I used to imagine I could see him. Have I ever told you that?" "Only every day," she said with a half smile and a glance at the horizon. "Yeah, well, it's important you feel this place is part of you, part of your roots." "Dad, I do. I always have," she yawned. He turned away from the view and looked at her full on. He reached over and cupped her face in his hands and lifted her chin. The skin of his hands was soft against her cheeks. A writer's hand, she supposed. "You never fail to surprise me, you know." "Yeah, well, I'm not a child anymore. I'm 14. She pouted her lips for teenage effect. "If the wind changes, you'll stay like that." "Oh, please, very funny. That is so old," she replied, getting to her feet. "God, I'm drenched." "Yeah, me too. Shall we head home? Scenic route?" Is there a route that's not scenic round here, then? Again you outwit me, he said with mock exasperation. They picked their way cautiously down the boggy pathway. He held on to her, steadying her. He gripped with all his fingers around the top of her arm. As she concentrated on avoiding the sheep's dropping, she tried to remember the first time she'd come here. She supposed she'd been maybe 3 or 4, but try as she might, the memory wouldn't come. They reached the car. The sun had come up now, holding its own in a cloudless sky. It was going to be a beautiful day. Kezia knew that something was wrong before she heard the screech of the brakes. Her dad had put the top down on the car, and despite the speed, 100 years passed as they rounded the blind bend. The car impacted with the lorry, and it pushed all reasoning thought from her, and yet, in that long moment, her senses were more alive than they had ever been. Every cell of her skin quivered with the force as if they were the strings of a harp. Like a slow-motion movie scene, the car crumpled and spun, spiraling across the grassy verge and into the dry stone wall beyond. They hit it head-on, loose boulders tumbling down on them, and the world went black.